You haven't paid the property taxes this year. Why not? My father's voice was calm, too calm. I stared at the bill he slid across the table. $8,700 due next week. For a moment, my brain refused to process it. A slow, creeping dread curled in my stomach. No, I whispered, barely hearing my own voice. No, this can't be happening. I swallowed hard, forcing my gaze back up. I never agreed to pay this. He sighed like I was a forgetful employee, not his daughter. You always have. It's your responsibility. Something inside me cracked. For years, I had just done it. Paid the bills, picked up the slack, kept the house running, thinking it was temporary, a necessity, a family obligation. But now he was acting like it had always been my job, like I owed him this. My fingers curled around the edge of the bill, knuckles whitening. I wasn't his daughter. I was just an ATM. Hi, I'm Olivia, and for years I was nothing more than my family's personal bank account, until the day I found out my father had secretly set aside $350,000 for my sister, while I was struggling just to keep us afloat. Would you have walked away, or would you have kept paying? Tell me in the comments, what would you do in my shoes? The Hamptons had always been my parents' pride. Sprawling gardens, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of old money elegance that screamed generational wealth. But that night, it felt suffocating. I sat at the long oak dining table, swirling wine in my glass, but the warmth of the chandelier overhead did nothing to thaw the ice settling in my stomach. My father, Robert Carter, sat at the head of the table, his silver hair neatly combed, his sharp blue eyes scanning me with something that felt dangerously close to expectation. My mother, Linda, kept her gaze down, her hands resting neatly in her lap, the way she always did when she didn't want to get involved. And Rachel, my younger sister, sat across from me, mindlessly scrolling through her phone, detached, entitled, oblivious. We were in the middle of casual conversation when my father leaned forward, folded his hands together, and said, "You haven't paid the property tax this year. Why not?" I blinked, my fork pausing midair. What? For a second, I thought I had misheard him. The words didn't make sense. I set my fork down carefully, fingers tightening around the stem of my wine glass. Excuse me? My voice was even, but my heart had already begun to race. He sighed, the kind of sigh that makes you feel like you've failed an invisible test. The property tax on this house, it's due, and you haven't covered it. I stared at him. My mother remained silent, her eyes now fixed on the pristine white tablecloth like she wished she could disappear into it. I took a slow, measured breath. I never agreed to pay the property taxes on this house. His expression didn't change. No shock, no hesitation, just expectation. You've always handled it. He waved a dismissive hand. It's your responsibility. My responsibility. A cold, sharp realization slid down my spine. I let out a short, humorless laugh. My responsibility? Dad, I've been paying for things here and there to help the family, but I never... You have the money, Olivia. His voice was firm, edged with that unwavering authority he had wielded over me since I was a child. Stop being selfish. My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. Selfish. The word slammed into me like a slap. I forced my hands to stay still in my lap, ignoring the way my nails bit into my skin. How much is the bill? My voice was steady. My father smirked. As if I had just confirmed exactly what he wanted to hear, he reached to his side and slid a white envelope across the table. I picked it up, fingers cold and unsteady. $8,700. My stomach twisted. I had paid this amount for 5 years in a row, never questioned it, never even hesitated, because my father had always made it sound like a temporary thing, a necessity, a family obligation, and like a fool, I had agreed. But now he acted as though it had always been my job, like I owed him this. I swallowed the lump in my throat and reached for the bill, but as I picked it up, something else caught my eye. An envelope partially hidden under a stack of magazines. A name in bold letters peeked out from the edge. Trust Fund, Rachel Carter. My pulse stuttered. Slowly, deliberately, I slid the envelope out from beneath the stack. "What's this?" I asked. A flicker of something, panic, crossed my father's face before he quickly masked it with irritation. He reached out, attempting to snatch it from my hands. "That's private," he snapped. But it was too late. My fingers had already pried the flap open. The first thing I saw was the number, $350,000. The room spun, a future secured, a life planned. All while I scraped by. Rachel, still absently scrolling on her phone, barely reacted. I scanned the document again, as if I had misread it. I hadn't. This wasn't just a trust fund. It was an actively growing account, carefully invested, generating interest. The same family that had told me there wasn't enough money to help me with college. The same father who had watched me work 2 jobs while studying just to afford tuition. The same man who insisted I take the bus at 16 because we couldn't afford a car for me. And yet, here it was. A carefully planned future for Rachel. For her. I set the papers down, my hands trembling. "When were you going to tell me about this?" Silence. My mother kept her gaze on her lap. My father said nothing. I turned to Rachel, pulse hammering. "Did you know?" She finally looked up from her phone, blinking in confusion. "Know what?" I exhaled sharply. "That dad has been funneling money into a trust fund for you while I've been the one paying for everything." Rachel frowned, looking between me and our father. "I mean, yeah, I knew about the trust, but what's the big deal? You make more money than I do." Something inside me snapped. I turned back to my father, who sat there calm, composed, completely unapologetic. "You were never supposed to see that," he muttered, stuffing the papers back into the envelope. I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that didn't even feel like mine. "That's your response? Not an explanation, not an apology, just, I wasn't supposed to see it." He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Rachel needs it more than you do." And there it was. The confirmation that had been years in the making. I had always known, had always felt, that things were different for Rachel and me. The dance lessons, the private school, the brand new car for her 16th birthday while I had scraped together tips from waitressing to afford a used Honda. The way she was given things while I was told I had to earn them. But now it was in black and white. Cold, hard numbers that spelled out exactly how much I was worth to my parents. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. My mother flinched, still refusing to look at me. My father remained still, watching me with that infuriating certainty. As if he knew that no matter how angry I was, I would still give in. But he was wrong. I turned to Rachel, my voice steady. "You can pay the taxes this year." Her mouth opened slightly like she might protest, but for once, I didn't care. I grabbed my coat, slung it over my shoulders, and strode toward the door. Behind me, my father spoke, his tone sharp, condescending. "Don't be dramatic, Olivia." I paused, my hand gripping the doorknob. Then I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance back. "Dramatic?" I repeated, my voice eerily calm. "Number, I'm just done." And with that, I walked out, letting the door slam shut behind me. That night, as I drove back to Manhattan, the reality of it all sank in. I had always believed that family was about love, about support, about showing up for each other. But sitting at that table, watching the people who had raised me treat me like an ATM instead of a daughter, I realized something chilling. Family, to them, wasn't about love. It was about leverage. And for the first time in my life, I was taking mine back. When I was 19, I sat across from my father in this very office, pleading with him to help me pay for college. I had gotten into NYU, my dream school. But no matter how many scholarships I won, no matter how many hours I worked at the campus cafe, there was still a gap, a few $1,000s, just enough that I couldn't cover it on my own. I remember the way he looked at me then, with that same unreadable expression, the one that made me feel like I was asking for too much. "We can't afford it," he had said simply. "You're smart, Olivia. You'll figure it out." And so I did. I picked up more shifts. I pulled all-nighters, juggling term papers and exhausted customers, running on caffeine and sheer willpower. I didn't have a choice. Now, 14 years later, I stood in his office again. But this time, I wasn't begging. This time, I wasn't 19. I wasn't powerless. I held in my hands proof that my father had been lying to me for years. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the leather-bound books that lined the walls. The scent of aged whiskey and expensive cigars filled the room, a stark contrast to the growing storm inside me. On his desk, beside a Mont Blanc pen and a polished nameplate, sat the envelope, the one I had taken from the dining table the night before, the one that confirmed what I had always suspected but never wanted to believe. Rachel's trust fund, $350,000, carefully invested, generating interest, a financial safety net built piece by piece while I had been drowning in student loans. I looked up, meeting my father's gaze. "You told me there was no money," I said, my voice steady despite the fire burning in my chest. "You let me believe that." Robert Carter didn't flinch. He simply leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose like he was bored. "Rachel isn't like you," he said finally. "She needs security." I stared at him, trying to process the sheer audacity of his words. I had always known there was a difference between Rachel and me. I just never realized how intentional it was. Security? My voice cracked on the word. What about me? He tilted his head slightly as if he didn't understand the question. "You've always been capable, independent. You didn't need help." A bitter laugh escaped me. "No, Dad, I needed help. I just wasn't given the luxury of expecting it." I dropped the envelope onto his desk. The soft thud of paper against wood felt like the closing of a door. "I want to be very clear about something," I said, my heart pounding. "I'm not paying for this house anymore, or Rachel's expenses, or anything else." For the first time, my father's expression shifted. His brows pulled together, not in anger, in amusement. He laughed. It was a low, quiet chuckle like I had just told a mildly amusing joke. "Olivia," he said, shaking his head, "don't be ridiculous." I swallowed, feeling my fingernails dig into my palms. "I'm not being ridiculous. I'm done." He sighed like I was being unreasonable. "And what do you think happens next?" I knew what he meant. He wasn't asking what I was going to do. He was warning me about what he was going to do. I forced myself to stand tall, even though my stomach was twisting itself into knots. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I guess we'll find out." I turned and walked toward the door. "Olivia." I froze. His voice was different this time. Not amused, not patronizing. Calm, measured, dangerous. "You don't just walk away from family," he said. A chill ran down my spine. For a moment, I thought of my mother, of how she had spent her entire life walking on eggshells around this man, bending and breaking herself to avoid his disapproval. I thought of Rachel, how she had been conditioned to believe that she was special, that she deserved things simply by existing. And then I thought of myself, of the years I had spent bending, giving, sacrificing, and how it had never been enough. I turned back just enough to meet his gaze. "Watch me." And then I walked out. The drive home was a blur. By the time I reached my apartment, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. I had never stood up to my father like that. Not really. Not in a way that actually meant something. I wasn't sure whether to feel proud or terrified. I kicked off my heels, sinking onto my couch. My mind was still racing, replaying the conversation over and over, wondering if I had made a mistake, if I should have handled it differently. But then I remembered the trust fund, the $350,000, and I knew I hadn't overreacted. The screen of my phone lit up, a text from Rachel. "WTF, Olivia? You're really going to screw over the family like this?" I stared at it, a hollow laugh escaping my lips. Of course she would take his side. Of course she would see it that way. For her, family had always been something that gave. She had never been the one expected to give back. I tossed my phone onto the coffee table and exhaled slowly. I needed to think, to plan, because if my father wanted to play this game, I was going to play it right. It only takes 3 days, 3 days of silence before the fallout begins. For the first time in years, my bank account remains untouched by family expenses. No automatic withdrawals for the property taxes on the vacation home. No quiet Venmo transfers to cover Rachel's car payment. No more bills slipping through my fingers under the guise of helping the family. At first, the quiet feels liberating. I wake up in my Manhattan apartment, a space that is entirely mine, without the usual anxiety clawing at my chest. I make coffee, sit by the floor-to-ceiling windows, and for once, I don't feel like I'm constantly running on empty. And then my phone starts ringing. I ignore it. Then comes the pounding on my door. Hard, impatient, familiar. I consider letting it go, letting them stew in their own mess. But the knocking doesn't stop. I exhale through my nose, set down my mug, and cross the room. The second I pull the door open, Rachel storms in like she owns the place. "You can't just stop paying," she snaps, gripping the strap of her designer purse like it's a lifeline. I let the door swing shut behind her, leaning against the frame. "Hello to you too, Rachel." She ignores my sarcasm, her brown eyes blazing with something sharp, something close to panic. "Dad's losing it," she says, words tumbling over each other. "The property tax bill is overdue. The homeowners association is on his ass. And my car payment?" She lets out a sharp, breathless laugh. "It bounced, Olivia. Do you even realize what you've done?" I sip my coffee, unbothered. "Yeah, Rachel, I do." Her mouth opens, then closes, like she expected a different answer. "You've always helped us," she insists, voice edging toward desperation. "Why are you doing this now?" I tilt my head. "Doing what?" "Punishing us," she shouts, gesturing wildly. "Over what? Some stupid trust fund?" I let out a low, bitter laugh. "Rachel, you have $350,000 sitting in an account waiting for you." I fold my arms. "Meanwhile, I've been paying for this family for years, while Dad told me we were broke. Do you not see the problem here?" She rolls her eyes, arms crossing over her chest. "Okay, yeah, but you make more money than me." I stare at her, incredulous. "Because I worked for it." She scoffs. "And you've always been good with money. I'm not. That's why Dad—" She stops short, but I already know what she was going to say. "That's why Dad made sure I was taken care of." I let out a slow breath, willing myself to stay patient. "Rachel, do you know how much I've spent on this family in the last 5 years?" She shrugs. "I don't know. A little here and there." I almost laugh. Instead, I walk over to my laptop, open the folder I had created weeks ago, and pull up the spreadsheet. Without a word, I turn the screen toward her. Her eyes flick across the numbers, at first disinterested, and then I see it. The shift. Her brow furrows. Her lips part slightly. Her fingers tighten around the strap of her purse. She scrolls and scrolls. I can almost hear the gears turning in her head. Finally, she looks up at me. This can't be right." I nod once. "It is." Her gaze snaps back to the screen. 5 years of property taxes. That's... She does the math in her head. $43,000? Yep. She swallows. "And Mom's medical bills? The ones insurance didn't cover? 12,000. Rachel's face has lost some of its color now. "And my car payments." I lean against the counter. "Over 11 grand. She shakes her head, frantic now. "No way, that can't be right. Dad said..." "Dad said what?" I interrupt, my voice sharper than I intended. "That there was no money? That it was just a little help here and there?" Rachel sways slightly, like her whole world has tilted. And maybe, for her, it has. But then, just as quickly, she schools her features into something defensive. "Okay," she says stiffly. "Fine, you paid for a lot. But you have more than me." And there it is, the entitlement so deeply ingrained in her that she doesn't even realize how absurd she sounds. I exhale slowly, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Rachel, I have more because I built it. You were handed everything while I was left to figure it out on my own." She doesn't respond. Instead, she shoves her phone into her purse and moves toward the door. You know what? Fine. Be like this. She yanks it open, stepping out into the hallway. But don't act surprised when this all blows up in your face. Then she's gone. And for the first time, I don't feel guilty watching her leave. An hour later, I sit in my home office, my laptop open to my banking app. No withdrawals. It feels surreal. Then I dial a number I haven't called in a while. It rings twice before a familiar voice answers. Olivia, David Reynolds, my financial advisor, greets me. Been a while. Yeah, I say, running a hand through my hair. I need your help. He chuckles. I figured. What's going on? I glance at the spreadsheet still open on my screen, at the sheer amount of money I had spent on my family. Money I would never get back. They're going to come after me, I say. Hard. David exhales on the other end of the line. All right, then let's make sure they can't touch a dime of what's yours. A sense of calm determination washes over me. Rachel might have been the first to come running, but my father, he was next, and he wouldn't be as easy to shake off. My father didn't call me, he didn't text. Instead, he sent my mother to do the dirty work. It was late. The city outside my apartment was alive with honking taxis and distant chatter, but inside, my world had shrunk to the glowing screen of my phone. The name flashing across it felt both familiar and foreign. Mom. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button. I knew exactly why she was calling. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But some part of me, some lingering thread of obligation, of daughterly duty, made me press accept. I put the phone to my ear. Hi, Mom. There was a pause, a heavy sigh. Then, in the soft, practiced voice I knew too well, she said, Sweetheart, your father is very upset. I closed my eyes. Of course he was. She continued, her voice careful, as if she was picking her way through broken glass. The property taxes are overdue. He doesn't understand why you're doing this to us. To us. My chest tightened, but I forced my voice to remain steady. To you? A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I let out a slow breath. Mom, I've been paying those taxes for 5 years. 5 years without a thank you, without any acknowledgement. And the second I stop, suddenly it's a problem? She sighed again, the same weary, rehearsed tone she always used when she wanted me to smooth things over. We thought you understood. I clenched my jaw. Understood what? She didn't answer immediately, so I filled in the silence for her. That I was supposed to bankroll this family forever? That Rachel deserves financial security while I work 2 jobs in college? That I should just accept that I'll always be the one sacrificing while she gets a free ride? For the first time, my mother faltered. We just assumed. She trailed off. And there it was. They had never asked me, never sat me down and had a conversation about what I was comfortable contributing, never once treated me like an individual with needs and goals of my own. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was an asset, a resource to be tapped into, not a person to be cared for. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my fingers tightening around my phone. I love you, Mom, I said quietly, truthfully, but I'm done being treated like a walking checkbook. Her voice cracked. My father will never admit he's wrong. She didn't argue, didn't agree either, and I knew then that she never would. A painful silence stretched between us. Then finally she said, The family meeting is set for Saturday, at the Hamptons' house. Of course it was. Of course he would gather the troops, summon the extended family, turn this into a trial where I was the defendant and he was the wounded patriarch. I let out a slow, measured breath. Okay, I said, I'll be there. And I hung up. The cold, hard truth settled in my bones. My father would never admit he was wrong. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let that stop me. I stepped into my parents' house, and it was already an ambush. The grand estate in the Hamptons had always felt imposing, but today it felt suffocating. The moment I walked through the door, I could feel the weight of expectation, manipulation, and disappointment pressing down on me like an iron vice. I had grown up in this house, learned to navigate its unspoken rules, the careful dance of pleasing my father while never expecting too much in return. But today, I wasn't here to dance. I was here to end this. The dining room was exactly as I expected, a stage set for confrontation. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table, like a king ready to pass judgment. To his right was my mother, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Across from them, my aunts and uncles whispered among themselves, exchanging looks like they were about to witness some great scandal. And then there was Rachel, sitting at the far end, avoiding my eyes. I had a feeling she knew how this was going to go. I took a breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped forward. My father didn't waste time. "This nonsense needs to stop," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "You've embarrassed us." There it was, not concern for me, not confusion about why I had finally stood up for myself. Just disappointment that I wasn't playing my role anymore. A Carter daughter should be grateful, obedient, and above all, silent. I dropped my bag onto the table with a loud thud, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Embarrassed you?" I repeated. "Dad, you do realize what you're saying, right? You're upset because I stopped paying for things I was never supposed to pay for in the first place." He scoffed. "You've always helped the family. That's what we do." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "No, Dad, that's what I do. Rachel, on the other hand, she just takes—" Rachel's head snapped up. "That's not fair." "Fair?" I cut her off. "Let's talk about fair." I reached into my bag, pulled out the folder, and slammed it onto the table. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. "What is this?" my father asked, his expression flickering with the first hints of unease. I flipped it open, my fingers steady despite the fire burning in my chest. "Receipts," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Bank transfers, medical bills, property taxes. Every dollar I've spent on this family since I started making money." I looked up, scanning the room as I spoke. $118,000. That's how much I've given. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even my mother looked shaken. Rachel's face paled. But my father, he remained stone cold. I pushed the papers toward him. "Why is it that Rachel gets a trust fund while I get a bill?" Silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then finally, my father leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his lips curled in a smirk. "Because Rachel needs help," he said simply. "You don't." And just like that, the air was sucked from the room. There it was, the truth so ugly and blatant it burned. I'd always known it deep down. But to hear him say it, to have it confirmed in front of everyone, it was a different kind of betrayal. My fingers curled into fists. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice shaking. "When I was working 2 jobs in college, barely sleeping, barely scraping by, you thought, she's fine, she doesn't need help. But Rachel, who never had to struggle a day in her life, she deserves financial security?" He didn't even blink. "That's right." A bitter laugh clawed its way up my throat. "Wow, at least you're finally being honest." I turned to my mother, who still hadn't spoken a word. "And you?" I asked, my voice softer now. "Did you ever fight for me?" She flinched. "Olivia." "No," I said, shaking my head. "Don't. I already know the answer." Her silence had been my answer my whole life. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I want you all to listen very carefully," I said, my voice slicing through the tension. "I am done. I won't pay for anything else. Ever." My father smirked. "We'll see about that." That was the moment I realized something terrifying. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't just angry that I had cut them off. He was planning his next move. I glanced at Rachel, whose lips were pressed together so tightly they had turned white. For the first time, she looked conflicted, like she was starting to see it, but not enough. Not yet. I turned on my heel and strode toward the door. "You don't just walk away from family, Olivia," my father called after me, his voice laced with quiet warning. I didn't turn around. I'm not walking away from family, I said, my hand on the doorknob. I'm walking away from you. And then I walked out. By the time I got back to Manhattan, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me exhausted and raw. But I wasn't stupid. I knew my father. He wasn't the type to accept defeat, and if he thought I would cave just because he threw a tantrum, he was sorely mistaken. I sat on my couch, pulled out my phone, and opened my banking app. Then I did something I should have done a long time ago. I locked everything down, new passwords, new security questions, removed myself from any joint accounts. My father wanted a fight. He was about to get one. The retaliation came fast and brutal. It started with the phone calls. At first, I let them go to voicemail, ignoring the buzzing of my phone as I went about my day. But the sheer persistence of it was overwhelming. Aunts, uncles, distant cousins, people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly cared deeply about family unity. Then came the texts. Mom, sweetheart, please just talk to your father. He's heartbroken. Aunt Margaret, Olivia, this is not how we handle family matters. You've always been the reasonable one. Why are you doing this? Uncle Patrick, I always thought you were smarter than this. Don't let your pride ruin everything. Pride. That's what they thought this was? Not self-respect? Not finally standing up for myself? I stared at my phone, my grip tightening. My father had wasted no time spinning this into a crisis, painting himself as the wronged patriarch and me as the ungrateful daughter who had turned her back on the family. I should have seen it coming, and yet the sheer speed of his retaliation was dizzying. My phone buzzed again, another missed call, another text. Aunt Margaret, Olivia, don't do this. You know family comes first. My fingers hovered over the screen. Was I making a mistake? Had I really turned my back on my family? I swallowed hard, my thoughts spiraling. Me, 19, begging my father to help with college. We can't afford it. Me, 24, paying mom's medical bills. You're smart, Olivia. You'll figure it out. Me, now. Finally saying no. I exhaled. I wasn't making a mistake. I was making a choice. It was early evening when the knocking started. 3 sharp raps. Impatient. I knew who it was before I even reached for the handle. Rachel. She stood in the hallway, her face pale, her lips pressed together. The confidence, the entitlement she usually carried like a shield was cracked, replaced by something I had rarely seen in her. Doubt. I sighed. Let me guess. Dad sent you. She stepped inside, shaking her head. No, she muttered. Not exactly. I crossed my arms, waiting. She hesitated, then blurted out, Dad's asking the extended family for money. I blinked. What? Rachel ran a hand through her hair. He's saying you're trying to destroy the Carter legacy, that you've abandoned us, that... She stopped herself, exhaling sharply. It's bad, Liv. I scoffed. Let me get this straight. He has a $350,000 trust fund for you, but instead of touching that money, he's asking other people to bail him out? Rachel shifted uncomfortably. I let out a dry laugh. Unbelievable. She flinched. Look, I don't agree with how he's handling this, okay? But, I don't know, maybe if you just... I held up a hand. Rachel, you do realize he's manipulating all of us, right? Silence. She avoided my gaze. For the first time, she didn't have a ready excuse. She sank onto my couch, her shoulders slumping. I just don't get it, she whispered. Why would he do this? I sat across from her, studying her face. She wasn't asking out of blind loyalty. She was asking because, for the first time, she genuinely wanted to understand. I sighed. Because power isn't just about money, I said quietly. It's about control. She looked up. He never cared that I was paying, I continued. As long as I was giving, as long as I was falling in line, he didn't have to manipulate me. But now? I gestured toward my phone. Now that I've stopped, he has to find a new way to maintain control. And if he can't control me, he'll control how other people see me. Rachel swallowed. So that's why he's turning everyone against you. Exactly. She was silent for a long moment. Then, so softly I almost missed it, she whispered, I think I've made a mistake. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she would finally stand up for herself. But then she stood. "I need to think," she said, her voice shaky. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. She reached the door, hesitated, then turned back. She shook her head. "Never mind." And then she left. I didn't chase after her, because I had seen it, the cracks in the illusion. For the first time, Rachel wasn't blindly defending our father. She wasn't rolling her eyes, calling me dramatic, or dismissing my anger. She was questioning, and that was a start. I exhaled slowly, reaching for my phone. I had one more call to make. I scrolled through my contacts and tapped on a familiar name. Ethan picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Liv," he said, his voice cautious. "You okay?" I let out a bitter laugh. Not even close. What happened? I hesitated, then said, "I think Rachel's starting to see it." A pause. Then, "Damn." I nodded to myself. Yeah, damn. Because if Rachel was starting to question things, that meant my father's control was slipping, and he wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. A week passed. A week of silence from my parents. A week of ignoring phone calls from distant relatives telling me to fix things. A week of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then I got the call. The number flashed across my screen. Rachel. I hesitated for half a second before answering. "Hey," I said cautiously, "can we meet?" Her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual bravado. I glanced at the clock. Where? There was a pause, then, Café Brio, in the Hamptons. Not the house. Not anywhere near our father. Neutral territory. That alone told me this wasn't going to be just another argument. "All right," I said, "I'll be there." I arrived at the cafe first, settling into a small table near the window. The place was mostly empty, save for a few locals reading newspapers and sipping overpriced lattes. It was the kind of place people went when they wanted privacy. Rachel showed up 10 minutes later. She looked different. Not in any obvious way, same sleek hair, same expensive coat, but her face wasn't guarded the way it usually was. She sat down across from me, hesitating before speaking. "I checked the bank accounts," she finally said, her voice unsteady. "Dad's been moving money." My fingers tightened around my coffee cup. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. Rachel swallowed. "I mean, he's pulling from my trust fund." A sharp, bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Of course he is." She flinched. I leaned forward, my voice softer now. "Rachel, now you see it. He never saw it as your money. It was always his." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze flickering toward the window. For most of her life, Rachel had believed she was untouchable, that she was special in our father's eyes, that the money set aside for her meant something deeper, security, love, loyalty. But now she knew the truth. Rachel let out a shaky breath. "I want to fix this." I studied her carefully. "How?" I asked, wary. She squared her shoulders, a flicker of her usual confidence returning. "I'll pay the property taxes myself, and I'll make sure you get what you're owed." I blinked, caught off guard. Of all the outcomes I had expected, this wasn't one of them. Rachel, taking responsibility. Rachel, choosing to untangle herself from our father's grip. "That's a big step," I said carefully. "Are you sure?" She nodded, a determined glint in her eyes. "Yeah, I am." I searched her face, looking for hesitation, for doubt. But for the first time in a long time, Rachel looked like someone who was making her own decisions. I exhaled, nodding. "Okay." A small, almost relieved smile crossed her lips. As we finished our coffee, I could feel the weight lifting. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something different. But one thought lingered in the back of my mind. Would our father let her go that easily? A legal document landed in my inbox. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the mouse. The subject line was simple, almost clinical. Property Transfer Agreement. I clicked, and there it was in black and white. Rachel had transferred 25% ownership of the vacation home to me. I exhaled slowly, my pulse steady. It was done. 2 days later, I sat in a sleek conference room at a law firm in Midtown, a contract spread out before me. The office smelled like expensive leather and fresh coffee, the quiet hum of business buzzing just beyond the glass walls. Rachel sat across from me, fidgeting with her bracelet. "This makes it official," she murmured. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane, nodded. "Once you sign, Olivia, you'll have 25% legal ownership of the Hamptons property. Your father cannot contest it." I picked up the pen. I wasn't sure what I expected to feel, vindication, triumph? But as I pressed ink to paper, all I felt was relief. No more obligations, no more guilt, no more wondering if I was imagining things, if I was overreacting, if I was the problem. I had been right all along. I had been used. And now, I was free. I slid the contract back toward Diane. "It's done." Rachel let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," I said quietly. She hesitated, then gave me a small nod. "You were right," she admitted. "About everything." It was the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. And honestly, it was enough. I didn't hear the explosion firsthand, but I felt the aftershocks. Rachel called me later that night. "Dad found out," she said. I could picture it. My father in his study, fists clenched, pacing the room while my mother sat quietly in the background, wringing her hands. "What did he say?" I asked. "He's furious, threatening to cut me off, but legally, there's nothing he can do." I let out a slow breath. "He won't cut you off." She was still his favorite. That wasn't going to change. She was quiet for a moment. "You were right about that, too." Later that night, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Mom, I'm proud of you." I stared at it for a long time. I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The next morning, I stepped out onto the streets of Manhattan, the cool autumn air crisp against my skin. The city hummed around me, cars honking, people moving, life continuing. I had spent so many years caught in the gravitational pull of my family, orbiting around their needs, their expectations, their manipulations. But today I was finally standing on my own. Some family bonds couldn't be fixed, but I was finally free. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's this. Your value is not measured by how much you give, especially to people who only take. For years, I believed that sacrificing for my family was a sign of love, of duty. But the truth is, love should never come with a price tag. Real love is mutual. It's not built on guilt, obligation, or the silent expectation that you'll keep giving until there's nothing left of you. Setting boundaries is not selfish. Protecting your financial future is not cruel. Saying no to those who have manipulated you does not make you a bad person. It makes you someone who finally understands their worth. I know many of you watching this have been in a similar situation. Maybe it's not about money. Maybe it's about emotional labor, time, or constantly being expected to put others before yourself. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Drop a 1 in the comments if you've ever felt trapped by family expectations. Tell me where you're watching from. I love connecting with all of you. Or if you didn't like this video, let me know why. Your thoughts matter. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge the way we think about family, boundaries, and self-respect, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes the hardest lessons in life are the ones that set us free. Subscribe now, and let's keep this conversation going.